So let's continue our discussion for Chapter 6, AI and Humanity. And we were talking about privacy. We were talking about what are concerns about privacy, what are transgressions, if you will, on individual privacy in different circumstances. It's clearly circumstance specific, right? So let's continue. This is video 2. Imagine Sherlock Holmes is able to look at you and infer everything about you. He observes your clothing and deduces what your occupation is. He observes your body language and can tell that you have a mental health condition. He looks at what you're carrying and infers that you're having family problems. We might think that that kind of information is private, yet Holmes, he's such a great detective, can infer such things using information that is public and out in the open. Is this an invasion of privacy? Of course, Holmes doesn't actually know these private things about you. He infers them as the most probable explanation based on what he has observed of you, which is public and in the open. Nevertheless, we might still feel that that is privileged information, even if it is just an educated guess. But is it ethically wrong to make inferences like that if the information is publicly available? You can probably see where we're going with this. If we say that Sherlock Holmes did nothing wrong by making such inferences, what about an algorithm that can read your tweets and infer your political, social, and ethical beliefs from them, even if you haven't posted them? Would that be ethically problematic? What is the moral difference between Holmes and the algorithm? If it is problematic, where do we draw the line when we say it is an invasion of privacy? Also, do we bear any responsibility for the information we put into the public that might allow others to learn private things about us? If it isn't ethically wrong, then why would it be wrong for someone to go through your garbage? What is the morally relevant difference? A good question. As we can see by considering some practical cases, privacy is not as straightforward as we might think. We might be inclined to expect privacy in some cases, but not others, and for different reasons. So we must be cautious when making sweeping ethical claims about privacy. It's easy to say that someone shouldn't invade someone else's privacy, but where do we draw the line when it comes to information you put out in the world for others to discover? What if someone could learn something very private about you based on seemingly unrelated information that you put in public? Let's consider the historical origins of the concept of privacy and what ethical functions we think privacy should perform in our lives so that we can consider the issue in relation to artificial intelligence specifically. The distinction between a public and private sphere of action dates back to the classical age, when philosophers like Aristotle drew a political distinction between the so-called poly, that is public sphere, and the oikos, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the private sphere. Modern conceptions of privacy, however, were largely informed by developments in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, articulated the so-called HARM, H-A-R-M principle. The only purpose for which, and it said this, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. This principle establishes a means of protecting private actions and beliefs from public regulation, provided they don't harm others. Mill's-Harm principle is also a defense of free speech from what he called the tyranny of the majority, establishing the principle that private people should have a right to their own private thoughts and beliefs. It was also around this time that the concept of property rights expanded to protect not only physical property, but also intellectual property in the form of copyright and patents. Not only was land no longer considered part of a shared commons, but ideas were protected from the public domain. In 1890, Samuel D. Warren and Louis Brandeis wrote an article for the Harvard Law Review titled "The Right to Privacy," which was seminal in articulating contemporary conceptions of privacy. They believed that over hundreds of years of English and American common law, the principle of a right to privacy had developed that wasn't covered by other legal concepts. Specifically, they argued that political, social, and economic changes entail the recognition of new rights, and the common law, in its eternal youth, grows to meet the demands of society. The concept of privacy was a living and evolving concept that changed over time in response to new social conditions. They argued that changing technological developments had required a new understanding of privacy, the right to be left alone expressed through the ability to prevent the publication of private materials. As they explained, instantaneous photographs and newspaper enterprise had invaded the sacred precincts of private and domestic life, and numerous mechanical devices threatened to make good the prediction that what whispered in the closet shall be proclaimed from the housetops. Note this was in 1890. In other words, the concept of privacy largely developed, with technological and scientific progress. In the 20th century, it developed to prevent public interference over private affairs. In the United States, the right to access contraceptives and abortion were justified by the right to privacy. In the decision of Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas asked, "Would we allow the police to search the sacred precincts of marital bedrooms for telltale signs of contraceptives?" The very idea is repulsive to the notions of privacy surrounding the marriage relationship. This precedent was key in later decisions regarding abortion rights in same-sex marriage. Historically, two broad concepts of privacy have emerged. The first can be expressed as a right to freedom from government interference in one's private life and private affairs. People have a right to make personal decisions about themselves and their families. The other conception of privacy is that one has a right to be left alone, in the sense that people have a private life that is free from public attention and public scrutiny. People have a right to control access to their own personal information and to prevent public disclosure of private facts. Nevertheless, this doesn't really tell us what privacy is or what its limits are. It's worth noting that the definition of the concept will follow when we already have a sense of what is private and what isn't, and what will count as an invasion of privacy. Thus, we must take care not to attempt to define the concept merely based on our own preconceived notions to justify what we already think should count as private. Okay, so we will continue this discussion about privacy in the next video, which will be video number 3 for April 21.